Tony. Antonio Zadra is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Montreal, and is a researcher at the Center for Advanced Research in Sleep Medicine. And Tony's published widely on dreams, nightmares, parasomnias of all different kinds, and specifically sleepwalking. And James has talked about some of his work on sleepwalking, and to provide a bit of context, it was reading some of Tony's work on sleepwalking that made me think, God, there's just all these issues that philosophers of mind and action are just be completely blind to. Just opened my eyes to all of these things, filled me with a whole bunch of questions. And I'm really happy that Tony has had the good patience to answer some of those questions, initially online, but then in person. And I'm really delighted that he can be here today. I should also say that his amazing book, When Brains Dream, is out, published by Norton, and is available in a smart new paperback edition, which you can get at all in-person bookshops. But Tony, I'm delighted to have you here again. I'm really looking forward to this talk. So what does it mean to be awake? Tony.
Right, well, thank you. And first of all, thank you, Tom and Matt, for inviting me back. So I guess, the first experience wasn't that horrible.
You passed.
So
yeah.
I passed,
yeah,
so
yeah.
good. Anyways, I'm really grateful to be here. And so today already we've had a lot of great discussions about what does it mean to be awake in different contexts. And so I'm going to present another way maybe of approaching the question, not really offering answers, but maybe different ways of thinking about it, which is, what does it mean to be awake while you are asleep? And so does such a thing even make sense? And I'll argue yes, and show different ways we can think about it. So first of all, when we think about what does it mean to be awake, historically in the sciences and in philosophy and just in everyday parlance, awake is often contrasted with sleep. What time did you wake up this morning? Please wake me up at 10. And so when we talk about being awake or wakeful consciousness, we can invoke things like first-person accounts. There's temporal dimensions. There's in a paper what Tom wrote, the capacities to consciously perceive and intentionally interact with one's environment. But like I said, it's often defined or presented, or in one of Matt's papers, a state of consciousness to which we typically surface when we wake up. So there's always this dynamic about conceptualizing what does it mean to be awake, but it's always relative to something else, and more commonly that something else is sleep. Now, people have focused on the transition. So in the definition, we surface to wakefulness, and so there's a transition where wakefulness disappears as we fall asleep, or we regain consciousness when we wake up. And a lot of people have sort of written about those transition periods, those gray areas. But I want to focus not on these gray areas, I want to focus on sleep itself and show you how different ways that either wakefulness or awareness, depending on one's perspective, can manifest itself. So like I said, sleep is typically viewed in opposition to wakefulness. Historically, in the sciences, always defined in terms of a state devoid of forms of consciousness. Maybe for some people with the exclusion of dreaming, but for some, even dreaming is not a bona fide state of consciousness. And so sleep and wakefulness are often viewed as these two global, mutually exclusive states. And there can be little transitions between them. So a rapid one when you wake up in the morning, or a more gradual one when you fall asleep at night. But increasingly, I'd say over the last 10 years, there's been a growing amount of evidence arguing for something known as local sleep. And so this view has been transforming our conceptualization. When I say our, especially sleep scientists, how we view sleep not as a global whole brain process, but something that is regulated really locally within different areas of the brain. And I'll give you examples of that. And by the way, every night when you fall asleep, your brain doesn't all go to sleep at once. So even in healthy individuals, your frontal parts of your brain will go to sleep before your posterior areas. And if you're sleep deprived, so you can actually have little islands of your brain that are falling asleep, and that's when you go during someone's talk. And this can also, the opposite can also happen. And so I'll be talking about that. And even just the falling asleep in terms of EEG activity, in terms of brain activity you can monitor. Scientists have well defined, this has been known for over 20 years, 9 different subsequent stages of falling asleep. And that kinds of images and thoughts we can have as we fall asleep, these hypnagogic images, are intimately tied to where we are in these 9 stages. So I'm just mentioning that because even something as simple as sleep onset, which can last 30 seconds, a few minutes, is really quite complex in terms of what's going on in the brain. So the idea of local sleep is that you can have portions of your brain that fall asleep while the rest of it is awake, or the opposite, where you have your whole brain, which is asleep, but you have little islands that come back online. And so this gives rise to a variety of very interesting states that relate to our conceptions of sleep and wakefulness. So I'll start with basic sleep stages. So some of you might be familiar, people talk about slow wave sleep or deep sleep or rapid eye movement sleep or most vivid dreaming takes place. And for most people, these are really well-defined sleep stages, going, oh, this is a disorder of slow wave sleep, oh, this only happens during that sleep onset. But the truth of the matter is, you have these pure states, but you have a lot of overlaps. It's like saying, well, this is the color red, and this is the color yellow. See how different they are. Yes, but you can also envision, or I should put up here, you can show a little transitions between one to the other, and you go, is that really yellow? Is that red? It's kind of orangey. And so the same thing with these sleep stages. Yes, there's these pure forms, but if you're a technician scoring sleep, it gets really complicated. And they're scored in sequences of 30 seconds, and some of them you go, this is not classifiable. This is a mixture of deep sleep and REM sleep, and so on. So it's not as, my point is just, it's not as clear cut as what often it's made out to be. And they're also all accompanied by different forms of sleep meditation. So in stage N1, which is when you are falling asleep, you can have these hypnagogic images. In N3, which is deep sleep, you can have somnambulism, sleep terrors. And incidentally, part of the arbitrary nature of this, there used to be another stage. Instead of N3, there used to be also N4. And to illustrate the arbitrariness of this, in N3 is when you had these high oscillation waves appearing that you see only in sleep. You never see it during wakefulness. And when you got at least 20% of it on a tracing, that was N3. And then when it hit 50%, it became N4. But those are just numbers that someone decided, hey, does 20% sound good to you? You might have said, oh, 25 might be better. Maybe it might have been 25. So, but people decided on 20 and 50. And then, a decade ago, when they revised the criteria, decided, well, 50, whatever. Let's just 20 and above. Let's just make that one stage. So, and that's what they did. So I'm just mentioning this because, again, there's a lot of arbitrariness and there's a lot of overlaps between these sleep stages, potentially. You have N2, which is really the first form of bona fide sleep, where you have these unique EEG markers of sleep. And of course, then you have rapid eye movement sleep, where most vivid dreaming takes place. So if I come back to the question, what does it mean to be asleep? So there's different sleep stages. But this concept of local sleep, what it teaches us is that you can have these sleep-related states that literally are a reflection of mixture of sleep and wakefulness. Parts of your brain are asleep and part of them are awake. And how do we know that? Well, we know it through brain imaging. We know what brains look like when they are awake and when they are asleep. And then you can notice that, okay, both patterns are co-occurring. We also know with depth electrodes, so you can put electrodes not on the surface of the head, but in the brain, usually for epileptic patients, find out where the epilepsy originates from. And so you can record from inside actual cells, and you can see them sending these high amplitude waves, which is slow wave sleep, and other regions where it's doing none of that. And again, you wouldn't have a sense that this was going on deep in the brain if you're just recording surface activity. And then there's also things like what we're doing at our lab with high density EEGs. It's basically, you have these nets that you put on people's head, and they're just covered with electrodes. So it just allows you to have really good spatial resolution. But on top of what's going on in the brain, which interests me, yes and no, depends who I speak to. If I'm at a sleep conference and I say that's really fascinating, but really I'm mostly interested by the experiences that we have. And to the extent possible, trying to map one onto the other. And so there's new techniques being developed. So one of them is microphenomenology, which are these interview techniques used during wakefulness, developed to try to improve people's abilities to report their subjective experiences. And we can apply that to also to experiences, we think, that occur during sleep. And there's also neurophenomenology, where you're trying to map on these very detailed first-person, moment-to-moment accounts of what is going on with the person with underlying neural activity. And maybe none of this works out, maybe it does, but at least it's fun to think that it's possible. All right, so what I want to, during this talk then, to focus on is this idea of what does it mean to be awake, what does it mean to be asleep, and what does it mean to be both? Right? So to move away from this dichotomy, and a bit like the previous talk about, awareness and how that relates to wakefulness, and can you dissociate the two? I'd like to do something similar with sleep and wakefulness. So I'll mention a few states that I think really illustrate these points well. The first is called sleep state misperception. So historically, this is people, it's also known as paradoxical insomnia. These are people who complain of really poor sleep, and you bring them to a sleep lab, and you go, oh my gosh, okay, so they slept like 8 hours. And then in the morning, they go, oh, I had a horrible night. I probably didn't sleep more than 2. No. And it's a very well documented, it's a subgroup of insomnia patients who suffer from this. So this is well demonstrated. But there's another form, much more specific form of sleep state misperception. These are people who fall asleep. So they're now in deep sleep, and you wake them up and they go, yeah, what's the problem? And you go, well, you fell asleep. No, I didn't. I said, yes, you were sleeping. No. Some of them are even snoring. And so you present to them the audio visual of them snoring. Well, that was just for a few seconds. It's like, well, no, it's been an hour and a half, right? And so they're mistakenly perceiving what by all physiological parameters we have, they are asleep, but they're perceiving it as being awake. Now, the question is, why is this happening? So for some people propose that it's because of memory encoding. So when they wake up, the last memory they have was them tossing and turning. And so they immediately go back to that, and they think nothing else has happened in between. So the idea that they've fallen asleep is kind of evacuated, and they're like, well, no, I was tossing and turning, and then I heard my voice I heard your voice on the intercom, and nothing else has happened. But what we now know in the last few years is that these patients, contrary to most healthy sleepers, have altered local sleep regulation. When you look at what's going on in their brain, you have areas of their brain while they are asleep that are showing these higher frequency activities that usually observe when people are awake. But it's only little parts of their brain. And so you see these shifts. And so another possibility, it's not really memory encoding, whatever, is that they're actually right. At a subjective level, somehow they're catching on to the idea that part of them, part of their minds, part of their brains, were sort of awake. And so they're not convinced that they slept. And so maybe they're not crazy, they're not, maybe they're onto something, or they're subjectively at some level catching on to something that is going on in their brains. So there's this idea of islands of wakefulness during sleep. And it just got me, when I was thinking about this, it got me thinking about this other much broader concept, which is islands of awareness. So in this paper in Trends in Neurosciences last year, 2 years ago, it was a fascinating to me paper on is it possible to have these cortical islands of awareness, these either brains, like people can have a hemispherectomy where half of their brains are disconnected from everything else. So literally disconnected. They're just left there. Sometimes they're removed. Again, usually for epilepsy. Like, could there be some awareness? It's half your brain that remains in there and that is sort of isolated. You can also grow mini brains in the lab, which more and more neurological institutes are doing, and they develop like human brains slowly. At least they show these early developmental stages. And so could there be awareness that grows in these neural tissues that become very complex? Anyways, so the idea of having these islands of awareness, these are more extreme cases, but it's clear that you can have these islands of awareness happening in areas of your brain during sleep. And like I said, you can also have islands of sleep that occur while you are awake, which is when you are nodding off and missing out on some things. Now, so that's sleep state misperception, which is quite fascinating and something we're starting to study with high density EEG. And again, because I'm part of that, I want to know what's going through these people's minds. So most of the researchers just want to look at what's going on in terms of EEG. And to me, if you're just looking at that and you're not looking at their subjective experience, you're missing half the equation, probably the most interesting half. We've already heard about sleepwalking again, and their behaviors, their eyes are open, and so on. I'll just give you an example. We now have over 400 examples of sleep mentation associated with sleepwalking. What I mean by that is detailed accounts of what was going through people's minds while they were sleepwalking, and often with recordings of their activities. So, and this one is one of the more dramatic cases, because it's someone who during an episode thinks that there's an intruder in the room. Spouse goes, no, look, there's no one, turns on the lights, see there's no one. The person thinks, well, maybe they moved to another room. The guy's like, look, I'll go to the other rooms, prove you there's no one. When the person leaves, the patient here screams, thinks that it's the aggressor, goes, oh my gosh, I gotta escape, opens the window, jumps, breaks both of her legs, jumps from 7 meters. There's also a similar case where the person wasn't as fortunate, didn't just break their legs, they fell on a picket fence, and the fence transpierced their legs. But that was another patient. So again, here, there's the issue that, well, you're perceiving things, you're reacting to it, again, to open a window, to talk to someone, I mean, you are interacting with at least part of your environment. But again, your rationale can be off. But if there's an aggressor and you think gonna kill you, well, jumping out the window makes sense. So it's just that there was no aggressor. So again, are they asleep? Are they awake? And by the way, I have metacognition there. One of my favorite examples, and we've had a few patients with this, is people during an episode say, look, to their spouse, right? Because the spouses get really annoyed because it's 2 in the morning and here's another episode and they're gonna have to do whatever. So the person has an episode and says, look, I know I have sleepwalking, this isn't one of them. There really is a danger. We need to get the kids, we need to get out of the house. So there's these metacognitive processes that can come in. So my point about sleepwalking is we now, again, there's been, fortunately or not, fortunately for science, not for the patients, there's people with epilepsy who also happen to be sleepwalkers. So because they're epileptic, they have these depth electrodes put into their brains, again, to know where is this arising so that the surgeons can remove the right parts of the brain and not too much and so on. These are people who don't respond to medication. But it also allowed recordings of what's going on in their brain when they have their episodes. There's only one case in the world where someone successfully did brain imaging during an episode of sleepwalking in a 16-year-old man. And we've done work on functional connectivity during episodes. And what all of these techniques show, and they're all very different ways of looking at the brain, is you have a coexistence of networks that usually are only activated when you are awake, really awake, and others only when you are in deep sleep. And so you really have this admixture of sleep and wakefulness. And so, which explains how can the person they're asleep navigate the world? Well, because there's some regions, responsible for perception and so on, which come back online. But why is their reasoning all off? Well, you have other areas that are still fully asleep. And so depending what areas are doing what, you have complex episodes, aggressive episodes, simple, complex, and so on. So you have this dynamic interplay between sleep and wakefulness in this disorder. Now, another, maybe lesser known one, but to me really fascinating, is a phenomenon known as false awakenings. These are people, and this can happen to anyone, it's not a disorder, that dream that they wake up. And so we've had that recorded in the lab where someone, we wake up someone out of REM sleep and then they're all confused and they go, "You just woke me up 2 minutes ago and I was telling you my dream." And I go, "No, we didn't." Like, you've been in REM for the last 20 minutes. So these people dream that they wake up or got woken up. We've had people who dream that they wake up and write down their dream, like in their dream diary, they're at home, right? And then really wake up and the page is blank. And so in the home environment, sometimes they will wake up, dream that their alarm went off, turn off their alarm, get up, hop in the shower, or they're doing breakfast. So if we stop right there and we ask, is the person awake? Well, they sure as hell think so. They know they just woke up, right? They are in their environment, they're starting their day. Some of them even know, I gotta go, I got a physics exam at 9, or I gotta go into work. So they're planning things out, and then they wake up for real. And then they're like, "Oh my gosh, what was that about?" And then in extreme cases, this can be nested multiple times. And then, you gotta lock them up. Again, this is interesting because it gets to the question of what does it mean to be asleep awake, even from a first-person point of view. And then we had a few discussions about lucid dreaming. So I want to mention a few recent studies on lucid dreams. So lucid dreams are essentially dreams in which you become aware that you are dreaming while still in the dream. Now, most lucid dreams take place in REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And the reason it's called rapid eye movement sleep is that even though you are sleeping and you have motor paralysis, you have this motor atonia that keeps you from acting out the content of your dreams, your eye muscles aren't inhibited. So your eyes move under their closed eyelids. And that's where the name REM sleep comes from. It turns out that you can ask lucid dreamers, if you ask them in their dream to move their eyes extreme left, right, that actually their physical eyes under their closed eyelids in the lab will move extreme left, right. And so if you have electrodes measuring these eye movements, they can signal to you from inside their dream that they're aware they're dreaming. So the first time this was done is 1978, so a long time ago. And the original record is actually here at the Science Museum in London. But this is what sort of these left, right eye signals look like. And they really stand out on EEG tracing, because usually the movements are sort of much more random or they disappear. So these extreme left, right signals stand out. So there was a question or a comment about time perception. One of the first studies done with respect to lucid dreaming is passage of time. So they basically had people, while they were awake, say, move your eyes, count to 10, move your eyes again, imagine counting to 10, and then move your eyes a third time. People are awake, so they're doing that. That's the top one. But then they had the same people who were lucid dreamers do this in the dream. The instruction was, if and when you become aware that you are dreaming, you do a signal, so we sort of timestamp it. Then we want you to count to 10. Then we want you to estimate 10 seconds and do a third signal. So you know that between signal 1 and 2, the person was counting to 10, and so you don't have to, wake someone up and they tell you the dream, and then you're looking at all these physiological channels trying to figure out when did it happen. You have these eye signals to timestamp. So you can look, how long did it take between signal 1 and 2? Well, it turns out roughly 10 seconds. And when they estimate between signal 2 and 3, roughly 10 seconds. So it doesn't mean that time perception, works in dreams. It's a bit like movies. A movie will last an hour and a half, but it can span decades, it can span centuries, there's scene shifts and so on. But on a very small scale, it seems to work. So this is some of the first studies that were done. Others they wanted to know, okay, well, what happens to your heart rate, respiration rate, if you work out in a dream? Like if you're dreaming that you're doing squats. So they actually had lucid dreamers try this out. So saying, well, try to find a gym in your dream or something and work out and signal when you're going to start. So here's someone who found weights and started doing squats. And so what they do is, do I have it? No. So basically they can signal when they're about to start doing their squats and when they finish. And what you see is that their heart rate increases. In this case, it goes from 71 beats per minute to 81. And the respiration rate from 19 respirations per minute to 29. So just by exercising in their lucid dream, their real physical body, there's an increase in heart rate and respiration rate. So the body asleep in the lab or anywhere in bed is actually responding to what you are dreaming about in ways that you would expect if you were awake. Now, another one is, well, you're gonna signal with your eyes when you're lucid, and then we want you to contract like this, your right hand or your left hand. And we know exactly, if you do this when you were awake, what parts of your motor cortex get activated when you move your hand. It's a very specific part of your sensory motor cortex. And we know when you're awake, if you do this in a scanner, what lights up. But here's what lights up if you do it in a lucid dream. It's pretty much the same areas. And actually it makes sense, because if it wasn't for the sleep paralysis, for this motor atonia that keeps you from acting out the content of your dream, your arm would probably move out of bed and go like this, or you'd have at least a little bit of that motion, depending on how much of the signals come through. So for your brain at least, dreaming of doing something, such as clenching your fists or whatever, and actually doing it is pretty much the same. So to me, this blurs the distinctions between sleep and wakefulness in terms of at least, in terms of neural processing. Now, again, in lucid dreaming, there's faculties that come online which are usually absent during normal dreaming, right? You are aware that you're dreaming. The really good ones are where they come into a lab and, oh yes, I know I'm in so-and-so's lab and I'm supposed to try out this experiment, so I gotta stop, I gotta signal, then I gotta do this. It's really quite demanding cognitively, right? And they can pull it off, and there's actually been a few studies looking at, well, what changes in these people when they are lucid dreaming from when they are non-lucid dreaming, even within the same REM period. So you're comparing the same people, apples and apples if you want. And so you have areas in your frontal lobes that come back online. And why is that interesting? Well, these are areas, if you're brain damaged, we know, for instance, that are responsible for metacognition. They're responsible for processing internal states, for self-monitoring. for planning and execution. All things usually that are really deficient in non-lucid dreams, right? We don't have critical thinking, we don't plan things ahead of time, we don't have really good judgment, right? Like you're in a dream and someone walks into the room and you go, oh, I'm Tom, I'm your twin brother, and you go, oh, I didn't know I had a twin brother, wow, that's so cool, right? You're not very critical. You should know if you have a twin brother, by the way. Other areas of your brain responsible for the experience of the self, again, episodic memories, memories for events as they occurred in the past, all come more online if you want than during typical REM sleep. And not surprisingly, areas in the back of your brain, not those that respond to visual input because your eyes are closed, but those that normally take those signals and make sense of them, they come back online. And so your brain is generating visual signals, right, because your eyes are closed. But then it's the same areas that go, okay, what are we seeing? What are we doing? You know, and how does this fit into the narrative of what we are experiencing? So again, these areas that come back online are closer to states of wakefulness than they are of sleep. Now, here's one experiment that I find particularly, I think the technical term is cool. So, Tom and Matt know that I have a long-standing interest, and we talked a bit about this last time I was here, about is dreaming, should we conceptualize dreaming more as a process related to imagination or to perception? Something that goes back to Aristotle. So here's a really cool thing. If you hold out your thumb like that, and then you just tell people, do a circle and follow it with your eyes. Right? Very simple task. And then you monitor where your eyes, you can monitor how your eyes are tracking this. And it'll do fairly smooth tracking. This is what it'll look like when you're actually doing it while you are awake. If you ask people then, okay, close your eyes and just imagine what you just did. And when you imagine doing that, your eyes are going all over the place, right? Because you don't have the feedback, there's no actual visual stimuli. Your thumb, you're sort of imagining doing it, and this is, on average, this is what your eyes look like. So they're not doing a very good job of tracking your imaginary thumb. Now they had lucid dreamers do that in their lucid dream, and they're monitoring their eyes. So they signal, I'm ready, I'm gonna do a circle, and here's what it looks like, all right? So tracking tracking perceptual elements in your dreams are much closer to perception than what you expect in imagination. Now, last time I was here, I talked about these other mind experiments we've done, thought experiments and actual lucid dream experiments, also speaking to this, where, anyways, if there's a question, I'll get back to it. But there's more and more evidence, as far as I'm concerned, arguing in favor of dreaming as a perceptual phenomenon much more than an imagination-based one. Now, we've known since 1978, beginning of the 1980s, that lucid dreamers can communicate by means of eye signals or even other means, forearm contractions, with experimenters in the lab. Now, last year came out a study from 6 different groups, if I recall, showing that two-way communication with lucid dreamers is possible. Now, the way it works is as follows. You have people come into the lab, and then when they are in REM sleep, you can present them, for instance, with sounds, tones, spoken voices, whatever. It can be flashing lights, so there's lights flashing above their closed eyelids at specific frequencies, or tactile stimuli, like someone tapping on their hand. And if they're lucid dreaming, they know sort of what to be, before they come to the lab, what they should be paying attention to. So something like, beware of any changes in luminosity in your dream. So lights flickering, things like that, because it could be your dream incorporating. You know, you mentioned the alarm clock getting incorporated into your dream. You can incorporate all kinds of things. And so it plays on this notion. You know, if you're aware of these things making their way into your dream, it's your cue that you're dreaming. And then inside these stimuli are nested questions, and I'll give you examples. And then you're supposed to answer the question. And you can do it either with eye movements, you can do it with facial contractions, like for yes, no. If in a dream you move your eyebrows, so you do a frown with your eyebrows, you'll have little discharges in your muscles of your real physical body in your lab. And so that's like a no. But if you smile and you're recording here, that can be a yes. So depending whether you're frowning in your dream or smiling, you can answer yes, no. It's a bit like the vegetative state and the equivalent of the tennis and walk in your room. So here's an example. So see, here's these ocular signals, right? Person goes, hey, I'm lucid, I'm in my dream, this is really fun, I'm aware that I'm dreaming, so I'm paying attention. And then the experimenter says, what is 8 minus 6? And the person gives 2 eye signals for the answer 2. And the person will repeat it, 8 minus 6, 2, right? If you ask them, what's 4 plus 1? They'll do 5 eye signals, right? So that's their way of answering. So, and you can do this across different modalities. So these are people who, and by the way, there's over 6 judges in different labs who's reviewed the EEG tracings, right? They're in unequivocal REM sleep. They're not partially awake, they're really, and you can't fake REM sleep because of this motor paralysis, that if you measure muscles, you see that they are inhibited even under your chin. Like if I ask you, James, inhibit your chin muscle right now. Like what? When you're awake, there's actually constant tension in it, right? In REM sleep, it disappears, and it only disappears in REM. And so you have all these different signals that tell you these people are in REM sleep. So they are perceiving clues, they know they're coming from the external world, and they are responding to them. A bit, again, like the vegetative state. Now, another way is, again, I've mentioned before, you can respond from a lucid dream with either whether you're frowning or smiling. So, and again, a smile means yes, a frown means no. So the person is in a lucid dream and they get asked, do you watch football? And the person responds, no. They give a no signal, which is the electrodes from their brows. And then you ask them, do you like chocolate? And then they answer yes. And you can keep on doing these things. So these are very simple experiments. Like I said, they're 1 year old. There's a bunch more labs now doing it. They're trying to use olfactory stimuli. But it's proof of concept, basically, that two-way communication with dreamers is possible. And now, one thing that interests several people, including our group, is, well, do you like chocolate? Do you watch football? Okay, good. But we can ask them, are you observing a face right now? Right? Like, you can ask them questions about what they are experiencing in the dream, right? And in dreams, for instance, if you focus on facial features of someone, they start getting usually quite distorted. And we know the areas when you are awake that get activated specifically for face perception. So we could look at what happens when you stare at a face in a dream. I mean, you could do lots of things. You could, you could ask them to turn around. How fast can your brain calculate what's behind you, right? I mean, there's all these things that you could explore by asking these questions and having them, especially if they are trained in these. So two-way communication in lucid dreaming is possible. And the way these things get, and by the way, in all the trials done, it doesn't happen that often. It's only about 18% that work. It's just not bad, but not great. Some people never hear the stimuli. Fascinating. Some people will actually answer the question correctly, like, a math problem, what's 4 plus 2, and they'll signal 6. Then when you wake them up, you ask them about the dream, they have no memory of the math question. But they experienced it because they answered correctly. And even someone goes, yeah, I was lucid, but I don't quite remember what I did, So So again, the memory of dreams for many of us fades quite rapidly upon awakening. There's other reasons for that. So there's some fascinating things about that. But like when people spoke, some of them said, I was watching TV and all of a sudden, the guy doing the news asked me, what is 8 minus 6? And I was like, whoa, what's that coming from? And he goes, oh yeah, okay, I'm in a lab. So how it gets worked into the dream is really fascinating. I gave you here's some examples. Some people had lights flash and they have to learn Morse code, and the patterns are sort of questions they're being asked. So that gets incorporated. One says, during the finger tapping, I was fighting against goblins. I remember being surprised that I was able to do so many things at the same time as the task. So the person tried answering the question, but didn't want to get killed by the goblins, so kept fighting the goblins and going, oh yeah, what's that math problem? So, interesting. And so, I mentioned this example to someone before, but again, lucid dreaming is often misunderstood because it's one thing to become aware that you're dreaming. To keep that awareness going is a whole other matter. It's very easy to forget that you're dreaming. So someone comes into your dream, tells you something, oh, James, I haven't seen you in a while, why don't we go to a pub? And I go, yeah, and then you just forget that you're dreaming. You just get swept in by the narrative. Sometimes your logic is off. So we've had lucid dreamers who are swimming underwater deep in the ocean and then go, oh my gosh, I got to surface, I need to breathe. No, you don't. But again, your logic is off. I think I was mentioning to someone that I once had a dream where I met Carl Jung and he was telling me all these great ideas. I was sure I was going to forget them, so my brilliant solution, my lucid dream, is to take notes. Not that brilliant when I woke up. It's like Jung was gone, my notes were gone, everything was gone. One example was that I recounted earlier was in a study in Germany where they had lucid dreamers try practicing throwing coins in their dreams, coins in a bucket, to see if they could improve their performance in wakefulness. And one person was doing it and then doing really well in their dream, and then they noticed that there'd be a sound. Every time the coin landed in the bucket, it would make a sound, like a splashing sound. So they went up to the bucket and then looked in, and there was water. And then the person looked up and going, oh my gosh, there's a leak in my ceiling. I gotta call my landlord. And that's it. They forgot that they were an experiment, that they were dreaming. So again, I think that these areas in your brain that allow you to have critical thinking and plan and execute, they come online, but they can just as easily go offline. And really takes a lot of training, unless you're a Zen Buddhist meditator, yoga specialist, to cultivate that. It happens, the really good natural lucid dreamers are like really like 1 in 1,000. Like if you want to have some of these people come into the lab, you gotta recruit at least 500 people or interview 500 people before you'll find one that can do this, that well. So it's really tricky. So back to the idea of islands of awareness, and this is I believe my final slide. So, the concept of islands of awareness is more, cortically isolated brains or whatever, but I wanted to extrapolate that to, functioning brains. Could you have little parts of your brain that are aware and others that are not? And what kind of experience does that lead to? And I think it leads to some of the kinds of experiences within sleep that I've been describing there, whether it's sleep state misperception, somnambulism, different forms of lucid dreaming. But it raises other questions, what's good evidence for these isolated, islands of awareness? What conditions might allow them to arise? How do you know? What do they feel like? And what implication does these kinds of evidence have for how we conceptualize and understand what it means to be awake, what it means to be asleep, what it means to be sort of nodding off, so asleep while you are awake, or my focus here, what does it mean to be awake while you are asleep? So to conclude, I think that historically, what it means to be asleep, just this unconscious state actually historically related to death, and death, as far as I know, is pretty far removed from consciousness or awareness. So what it means to be, asleep, what it means to be awake, what does it mean to be aware that you are awake, or in our case, aware that you are asleep, might seem quite simple, but when you start looking at it, it's really a multi-layered problem that we can address, as we've seen already today, from many different angles. And so my point today was just to highlight these sleep-related states that I think have something to teach us or tell us about what's possible when mixing these two concepts. Thank you.